Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from Shura called Nothing's Real. You know, I don't know what the hell is happening with synthpop in 2016. You see, you go back to 2015, it seemed like every other week I was covering yet another band drawing from various points in the 1980s to update their sound, for better or for worse, and that happened a lot in 2014 too. 2016 though, I don't know if I just haven't covered a lot of it, but that quick spurt of tight synth-driven and accessible music seems to have faded almost as quickly as it's come, either splitting towards the more immediately danceable and profitable electronic scene, or towards different eras of retro sound. And honestly, that's a little bit dispiriting in my books. As much as the 1980s felt like a well-trod ground when it came to musical nostalgia, I still feel that there could have been more to be done in terms of balancing the old and the new in the modern age if properly given the chance. As such, I was definitely curious to cover Shura, a British producer and singer-songwriter who built some groundswell on YouTube with a string of singles and got signed to Polydor for her first album, starting her first ever headlining tour this year with Tegan Sara. Now, to me, a lot of that is a really good sign, because the label's clearly supporting her, and even if this album's rollout has seen nearly every single song on it become a single, which you kind of expect given her YouTube roots is kind of common here, it seemed like there was some serious attention given to her as a songwriter who aimed for a more confessional and detailed side of writing that you don't often see in the stereotype about synthpop. So I figured what the hell, and I checked out her debut album, Nothing's Real. How did that go? Well, honestly, a lot better than I expected. This album really came as a pleasant surprise for me in the same way that Emotion from Carly Rae Jepsen did last year, and arguably, it's even better. Perhaps not quite as immediately catchy, but with tighter writing and grooves and fewer missteps. And while I don't quite expect critics to fall over themselves praising this album, a shame, because it really is great. It's going to become underrated this year. I do think that it'll quietly pick up a lot of attention and maybe become a sleeper hit, because while it doesn't immediately grab you, it definitely will stick with you. I can say that for sure. And you know what? I'm trying to figure out why that is. So let's start off with Shura herself. As a singer, she said her main influence was Janet Jackson, and you can definitely tell in her husky, tightly multi-track delivery. And while you could argue that she never really cuts loose here, it's also not an album that's aiming for that sort of bombast or rawness. It's a record that's aiming for subtlety and smaller emotions, relying on Shura to convey enough through her delivery and charisma to pull in the audience. And here's the thing, she's not exactly a presence that will dominate a song so much as ride and complement the grooves, but she compensates for that with tasteful multi-tracking only when she needs it, real production that preserves some great vocal texture, and most importantly, a commitment to interesting and distinct melody lines that often add to the underlying instrumental and hook, not just mimic them, which is really quite a nice refreshing change in the modern synthpop age. And on the topic of instrumentation and production, this is what 80s revival synthpop should sound like, because the production here is fantastic. Again, while there's a part of me that wishes things could go a little bit bigger, while this album could cut loose a little bit more in terms of the guitar lines, maybe throw in a solo or two, I'm also very much aware that this album is aiming to be a much more intimate, streamlined affair, with the sort of textured analog synths that have presence but never quite the same immediate bite. Again, that's not saying these instrumentals can't capture that nervous, uncertain atmosphere that often ran in the emotional core of new wave, but she's getting there with more tact, with quicker tempos, tighter melodic interplay, and letting natural analog crackle and hints of futuristic effects and guitar stings add to all that momentum. And none of it obscures the foundational melodies of the songs, which means that even the slower tracks have remarkably strong hooks that never feel like a retread for me, with a mix expansive enough not just to sound more expensive than it probably was, but also to intensify these feelings of anxiety and loneliness. And all the more impressively, there's not a lot of reverb using there. And sure, all these are tricks that the 80s pretty much perfected, but what I also appreciated was the amount of liquid guitar tones that filled up the mix to play off the synth. Right from the very start, against the strings on the title track to the hook of Kids and Stuff that ends with the chorus of a really bright spike of atonal synth before a harsher guitar hit takes a few notes to anchor all that anger. Or take how that little guitar fills up the back half of the hook on Indecision against the rubbery beat, the more elegant synth and the piano counter melody. The guitars, they actually take more prominence towards the back half of this album, from the misty, borderline war on drugs atmosphere against that sturdy bass line, or the choppier chimes touch tongue-tied with the synth tone that feels straight out of a Toto song, or how it takes a thicker prominence against the watery flutters of Make It Up, especially on that hook, or the distant tolls over the smoke of white light that goes straight for early 80s alien sounds with the wiry gurgle of the synth, and actually mostly sticks the landing, especially when the outro reassembles with the guitar line all the more strong. But even the songs where the guitarists take less of a role, like on the bare bones bass and piano of Touch, or the delicate popping beat and spikes of synth on Too Shy, The melodies are so damn good, I can't help but be pulled in by this. Again, that's not saying this album isn't without its missteps, but instrumentally, they're pretty minor. Mostly in songs that can feel a tad overlong, like White Light and Kids and stuff, even with the half-assembled hidden track of White Light that really kind of feels peripheral until you start digging into the themes. And the only dud on this album for me is the Space Tapes, a 9-minute blurred over series of sampled demos and remixes of 3 songs from this album mashed together, complete with pitch shifting that I could have done without. But even still, it's not terrible. It's pretty much a bonus track for the digital version of the album, and it's fairly easy to ignore. Most places I would skip it no problem. But where I really want to talk about this record is in the lyrics and themes, and where Shura takes a step you don't often see in new wave synthpop: straightforward vulnerability. As I said before, most new wave had a mood of nervous anxiety, but always tends to try to obscure it with flash and tighter grooves. Shura might have some of those grooves, but she tilts more into the real vulnerability that Janet Jackson showed on some of her quieter material in the 80s, and doesn't shy away from quieter, yet no less intense emotions. Now, while I'll get to the narrative of this album in a second, I really do love how it's framed, because while everyone around her is telling Shura that it's all gonna be okay, it's all gonna be fine, it's all gonna work out, even her own mind telling her that, it only serves to turn her emotions inward, and while she's mature enough to understand these emotions, it doesn't exactly make them go away or become less strong. But now onto the narrative and themes. Well, okay, on the very surface, you could describe it as a breakup album, but of course it gets more complicated, as this woman did come back into her life, and they try to sustain a friendship, as she describes it, a romantic friendship, that almost seems loaded with too many long-buried emotions to actually work in the end, which leads to a second breakup that seems to cut just as deep. And while on What It's Gonna Be and Tongue-Tied and Too Shy, you see the hesitation and uncertainty that undercuts the confidence of the hookups and emotional connections, they're straightforward enough to just work all the more strongly. They come from a genuine place. And that's saying nothing of the songs where the relationship is just falling apart in slow motion, like on Kids and Stuff and What Happened to Us and Make Up, and especially Touch, which features probably my favorite line on the album with, "We start to live the lies we tell ourselves." One of the most perfect ways to capture trying to remain friends with an ex where the deeper feelings haven't quite cooled off yet. And yet, all around this album are interludes and snippets where we hear conversations with Shura and her family, including a hidden track in the back of White Light where she shows fear of her parents dying. And believe it or not, this actually makes sense thematically, because this record values that ephemeral connection you have between people. Relationships might fall apart, families might split apart or die, but you want to hold on to something there as long as you can, even if it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And sure, this might seem like a pretty basic emotional truth in order to express it, but this album's greatest strengths coming in its simplicity and its cohesion, holding together fleeting emotional connections when logic would see them fail, because damn it, there's something there that has value. There's poignancy and humanity, and even a subtle type of romance in that desperation. And when balanced against how well this album can hold its melodic structures and grooves together and be ridiculously catchy for it all, you have a quietly powerful work that really does grab hold of you, at least for me. For me, Nothing's Real by Shura is easily one of the best pop albums I've heard in 2016 thus far, netting it a solid 8 out of 10 and certainly a recommendation, especially if you're a fan of 80s synth pop, a bit of R&B, and Janet Jackson in particular. This is a sort of self-assured and quietly brilliant album from a writer-producer who's showing volumes of potential. Folks, do not miss out on this album. It really is something special. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. Got the poll up here, so what can you guys think of this album? Do you think you liked it as much as I did, or do you think it kind of fell short? Honestly, this album's amazing. It gets better with every single listen. I can see this as being one of my favorites of this year. It really did stick with me. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I will try to give them a listen. I got a bit of a slow time right now, so I'm going to try to get through some of my existing backlog, because of course I've got a backlog. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.